Thanks for coming to my talk. Today I'll be giving a talk on this title here, Irradiated Inscriptions of Life, Melanin and the Formation of Fungi and Birthmarks, or melanocytic nevi. I'm Chris Rudge. Currently I'm a researcher in neurolaw at the Sydney Law School, specifically within the Centre for Health Governance, Law and Ethics, also a casual tutor in the Department of English there. So the paper today is roughly organised into 5 sections. I'll be talking about melanin in scientific and socio-cultural history and theory. I'll be thinking about melanin's potential function. Weird melanin, fungi at Chernobyl. 4, Descartes, birthmarks, melanin and melatonin, and how they're all connected. And finally, I'll be addressing what I call the melanotic imagination, from materialism to mesmerism. All right, first, melanin. So melanin as a word has its etymological root in the Greek words melanos and melas, which mean black and dark respectively. Most scientists agree that it was first used as a term by the biological scientist or chemist Jöns Jacob Berzelius in 1840, although its general discussion can be traced to pharaonic medicine. Melanins are biopolymers and they're largely made up of indole compounds, but their overall composition still remains unknown. They're produced mostly in humans in the melanocytes, the cells located at the bottom layer of the skin's epidermis. They're made by the process of what's called melanogenesis, which leads to the long-lasting pigmentation of the integument, that is, the human's surface elements such as the skin, hair, and nails. Understood as the material basis for integument pigmentation in mammals, melanin's history is as long as the history of mammalian evolution itself. In a recent work titled The Melanin Millennium, Skin Color as 21st Century International Discourse, editor Ronald E. Hall calls his book A Treatise on Psychological Colonization by Skin Color. He calls specifically this colonization, another way of describing racism, the, quote, proof of the West's intellectual narcissism, unquote. But even as a work of revolutionary social theory, and an interesting one, what's striking about the book is its biological focus. It features chapters on pigmentation disorders and the psychopathology of skin bleaching, and in this way alludes to melanin's epigenetic and even metabiological power. So 2 kinds of melanin appear in humans and other animals. Eumelanin, where Eu equals good, which is black or brown in colour, and pheomelanin, where phe means dusky, which is yellow to red. In Skin, A Natural History, Nina Jablonski describes how, as we all know, quote, in the Homo sapiens, skin colours make up an exquisite palette, varying in almost imperceptible degrees from the palest ivories to the darkest browns, unquote. So a striation of evolutionary theories are advanced continuingly today for melanin's function, although even whether it's an environmental adaptation has been questioned. In 1996, the French biochemist J.P. Cesarini outlined 6 possible evolutionary mechanisms for melanin in a paper that is still perhaps one of the most accessible or summary of these possible evolutionary mechanisms. The first was camouflage or adornment, so to hide or to communicate mating cues. It secondly might be a thermoregulation system that absorbs visible and infrared radiation and disperses it between hairs and through capillary dilation or dilatation. Thirdly, it might be a sunscreen that absorbs ultraviolet radiation as a shield. Fourthly, it might be an ion or drug binding element that binds to metals and detoxifies the skin of these metals, or the keratocytes in the skin cells. Fifthly, it could be a pigment that acts like an amorphous semiconductor or like a solenoid, so transforming light energy into electrical energy or other kinds of energy. And sixthly and finally, it could be a producer of vitamin D, since this is the vitamin produced in the epidermis following UVB radiation. So today I'm interested in thinking about Cesarini penultimate hypothesis, that is the one that melanin is a pigment that transforms one kind of energy into another. But I'm interested in thinking about this energy conversion in the broadest possible sense. So let's have a look at some weird fungi, shall we? But first of all, I just want to stress that melanins even today remain enigmatic pigments about which remarkably little is known. They're impossible to study because, as Joshua D. Nossenchuk and Casadevall argued in 2003, they're amorphous, insoluble, and not amenable to solution or crystallographic structural studies. Knowing their structural and biochemical properties, therefore, still remains beyond our current analytical horizon. That's as true today as it was in 2003. Of course, some allege that there are constitutive differences between human and fungal melanins. Just before I move on to fungi now, then the reason they allege these differences is because humans produce melanin inside cells, that is intracellularly, and fungi do so outside of cells, extracellularly. But any biochemical difference between them presently remains conjectural only, since they resist crystallographic and other studies. Okay, so now I will briefly describe what I'm calling a form of neolife, namely the melanized, or as they're sometimes so called, melanotic fungi that inhabit some of the most uncongenial environments in the world and beyond. 11 years after the 1986 accident that destroyed the fourth reactor at Chernobyl, scientists collected samples within the inner regions of the containment structures and found proliferation of fungi. So let's go in there and have a look. That's a few of them there, 4 samples there. So the authors discovered that these fungi were potentially active biodestructors of even extremely radioactive substrates, and that they received 100,000 times as much radiation as anything else does elsewhere on the planet. Melanized fungi, I should note, has also been found on space satellites, and particularly the orbital space satellite, the Russian orbital space satellite Mir, as well as in the Arctic and Antarctic zones. In 2007, other researchers suggested that these fungi were actually converting the ionizing radiation in Chernobyl into energy and harnessing it for their own growth. So in other words, they exhibited a practice in which they ate the radiation like food to continue their own life and to adapt to their environment and remain alive. That was in 2007. More recently, in 2012, scientists fed mice that were undergoing the equivalent of radiotherapy melanized mushrooms to see if their tissues could be radioprotected against the ionizing radiation to which they were exposed. And they were. Hence, the role of melanin in radioprotection was proven, they said, by the fact that mice given white mushrooms supplemented with melanin survived at the same rate as the other set of mice given black mushrooms. So those undergoing radiotherapy, humans I mean, might be protected, they found, from radiation by supplementing their bodies with oral radioprotectors. Okay, so now I want to talk about Descartes' 17th century speculations about the pathogenesis of birthmarks, and I'll illustrate how this is related to the fungi and the melanin shortly. But before we do, I just want to say a brown birthmark is called a melanocytic nevus. So just terminologically, we call the process of these birthmarks' origin NeoGenesis. So here, for your information, is the nevus on my back. So you might say I have skin in the game regarding this research. Okay, so Descartes was the first among his contemporaries to propose a mechanical hypothesis for NeoGenesis in his La Dialectique of 1637. I could show you, he boasted, how an attractive image in a woman's eyes sometimes passes from the pineal gland to the arteries of that pregnant woman and to some determined member of the child she carried in her womb, and there forms those birthmarks that cause so much wonder among the learned. So an interesting theory there. Another one also appears in the work of a psychiatrist who was formerly chair of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, Ian Stephenson, who offers an equally outlandish explanation, perhaps, for NeoGenesis in his book Reincarnation and Biology, a contribution to the etiology of birthmarks and birth defects. Stephenson draws correlations between the nevus that appears on those whom he examines, or the photos of those whom he examines, and wounds that appeared on bodies of those persons' ancestors or other kin. So where a birthmark might have formed on the chest, researchers pursued to discover whether an ancestor or relative of that marked person had suffered any trauma to the chest in the same place. So it's an interesting theory, worth checking out perhaps. But for me, going back to Descartes, the chief problem of his nevogenic hypothesis is that the substance produced by the pineal gland, to which he refers, in the brain, is not melanin, which, as I will show, or as you may have already guessed, produces the nevus, but rather a different substance, namely the secretion of the pineal gland, which is called melatonin. Okay, so first I'll just offer a little on melatonin, which is a different substance to melanin. So melatonin's function has been the subject of thousands of studies, but just as melanin, its action remains to be clarified. But essentially it's the secretion of the pineal gland, this singular gland within the brain, the only thing that is kind of a unitary and singular, non-paired or non-twinned entity within the brain. And its production is regulated by circadian rhythms, that is the production of melatonin. Melatonin is thought to play a neuroprotective and cardioprotective role, but there are perhaps as many hypotheses about its function as there are about melanin's function. So the interaction of melanin and melatonin is, when it has been discussed, which is to say rarely, incredibly complex. And my work on this has revealed that scientists simply cannot explain it yet, not in a simple way anyway. So, but nevertheless, here's one diagram on screen that schematizes the interaction of melatonin and melanin. And you can see how complex it is. Beyond that, I should just note the article in which this appears is titled, as you can see at the top there, High Maternal Melanin Concentration in Fetal Developmental Abnormalities. So we can quite readily see the link between this article in which this diagram appears and Descartes' theory of maternal pineal gland secretions that travel down the artery, having some operative effect on the fetus. There are some interesting hypotheses about melatonin's role in neogenesis, however, and one study said that prenatally information about day length and circadian phase, presumably mediated by the maternal melatonin rhythm, is transferred to the fetus. Thus, photoperiodic information perceived by the mother plays a role in synchronizing fetal physiology. And here's a schematic representation of the pathway and role of melatonin in the maternal placental fetal system. We can see up the top, as I've noted there, the mother's eye, and then at the bottom, melanin production in the fetus. There you can see cell proliferation and fetal growth, of which a part would be the melanin production. So there are some interesting green shoots or signifiers of a potential research project on Descartes' theory, but as of yet, there's nothing that really deals with it explicitly, nor anything that can confirm or completely rule out the theory, outlandish though it seems. So, nevertheless, despite these interesting green shoots, as I've called them, the remoteness of melatonin from the science of neogenesis is perhaps quite summarily demonstrated by the fact that, for example, the word melatonin appears exactly 0 times on this book here, on NeoGenesis, Mechanisms and Clinical Implications of Nevus Development. Melatonin, not mentioned a single time in this some 600-page book. Therefore, you would have to think that melatonin is not generally considered related to NeoGenesis. And here are some nevi for us to look at. None of them as big as my own, notably. More on that same point, almost nothing has been written on melatonin's ability to modulate skin color, and neither of these books appearing on screen now mentions the word melatonin either, notwithstanding their obvious from their titles, their acute and strong focus on the development of nevi and melanin cells, which is, say, melanocytes. In fact, almost nothing has been written on melatonin's ability to modulate skin color, as I said. But the striking exception to this is the very first paper that was written on melatonin, and which in fact identified it and named it, a paper written in 1958. There, the author, Aaron B. Lerner, and his colleagues, noted that the pineal gland extracts, as he called them, the ones that he had actually extracted and derived from cows or bovines, could, when they were injected in frogs, and would, in fact, lighten these amphibians' skin. Now, that's the experiment that was noted here in this letter in 1958, and Lerner did a few studies after this, many in fact, but this is the first study of its kind, the one in which melatonin is in fact named and identified for the first time. You can see that there in that highlighted area at the bottom sentence. Now, this is an interesting problem, however, when we're thinking of Descartes' theory, because here we have a paper that says that melatonin, when extracted from bovines and injected in frogs, actually lightens the skin color of those amphibians rather than darkens it. You would think that if melatonin was responsible for nevogenesis, for creating birthmarks, that it would in fact darken the skin. So this presented a problem when I was researching. I thought, well, we've actually got something that directly, or perhaps indirectly, contradicts Descartes, but in quite a direct way suggests that Descartes' theory might be the opposite. The opposite effect might arise from melatonin's secretion. Until I looked at what the aggregation of the melano or the melanin granules, the melanosomes, actually looks like. And so here's two visual representations of it. So when we look at how the frog's skin actually lightens when the melatonin is injected into it, we find that it does so by, as I was suggesting, aggregating all of the melanin granules, which is to say the melanosomes. And when it does this aggregation, it creates a spot or a kind of assemblage of these pigment melanin granules, and would appear to create a spot or a mark, and perhaps even a nevus. So, absent as I am of formal scientific training, I yet make this proposition that Descartes could well have been onto something, and that melatonin could and likely does play a role in nevogenesis. So in this way we can speculate that Descartes was onto something. But no one who has looked at Descartes' theory, I note, that I've found, has yet attempted to recuperate it or to confirm it scientifically. In fact, all the scholars that I've looked at have dismissed it outright. Okay, so let's move on to some more cultural and humanistic aspects of what I've discussed today. So now I'm thinking I want to suggest that there's a sense in which the melanotic fungi that I referred to earlier at Chernobyl don't simply convert the gamma radiation that they encounter into energy that sustains their life, but that they also, in a more metaphysical, phenomenological sense, impress that radiation to such a degree that the toxic effects communicated by the radiation and in the interaction between the radiation and the fungi diminish or attenuate. In a similar manner, I want to say that we can propose a similarly diminished or attenuated energy exchange occurs in between those who possess birthmarks and those who cast their radiating minds upon them. As Descartes himself points out, nevi do have this effect on the observers. In his words, they cause so much wonder among the learned. So to suggest as much is to take melanin, and here nevi as a potent aggregation of melanin granules, as a transcendental signifier, one that engenders a disoriented affective response in its spectator. In this model, the nevus functions as a sort of suspect sign that causes even the intellectual elite to become confounded, mollifying them and delimiting their powers of explanation. So the idea that birthmarks might cause such spectatorial effects has actually become a commonplace in literary texts. Some works of literature treat marked individuals, those exhibiting nevi, as witches, and others associate those persons with the devil, owing to what they might describe as a mark of the beast. But birthmarks can also elicit sympathy and even erotic energy from their beholders. And both kinds of this latter responsive energy, the sympathetic and erotic, appear in Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Birthmark, a short story whose nevus-bearing protagonist, Georgiana, finds herself in a difficult predicament. While her scientist husband, whom we can see there on the left in that painting, wishes for nothing more than to remove the birthmark that adorns her cheek, other admirers feel differently, and, as Hawthorne writes, were wont to say that some fairy at her birth hour had laid her tiny hand upon the infant's cheek and left this impress there in token of the magic endowments that were to give her such a sway over all hearts. So, thinking of melanin in this way, we can see how its effects extend far beyond the microbiological, and they enter into the social and cultural, which is a fairly commonplace thing to say when we consider race studies and other areas of study in which colour and to be scientific, melanin is articulated as a signifier of difference and otherness. But the birthmark in particular, in Hawthorne's novel and in culture, I want to say, becomes a very notable radiating sign. It's a mesmeric agent that cannot be reduced in a way that perhaps race is so often reduced. And it's a signifier that engenders great intellectual and social confusion, confoundedness, and energy, to be kind of perhaps most objective about it, whether that energy is both positive or either positive or negative. So increasingly, we see in contemporary culture such marked persons as Georgiana from Hawthorne's short story harnessing the energy of their nevi or of their marks, such as a birthmark blogger and dancer Cassandra Nord, pictured here on screen. Just whether this potential, which is to say the potential of birthmarks, the potential of nevi, the potential of melanin, might be harnessed in new ways, remains perhaps literally yet to be seen. I think I'll leave it there today. Thank you very much for your attention. My details are on screen, my email and Twitter account there, and I'd love to hear from you. Thanks very much.